started tonight. Hello, everybody. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Wendy Sun. I'm a third-year resident at Yale New Haven Health, and I'm this year's SAEM Rams president. And I'm so excited to welcome you to our third installment of the From Match to First Promotion webinar series, where we'll be discussing contract negotiation and securing your first job like a pro. We have such an incredible night planned for you with our awesome speakers. So without further ado, I would love for our speakers to introduce themselves. So Dr. Hannah Hughes.
Yeah, hey everybody, my name is Hannah. I am an assistant professor at the University of Cincinnati and the immediate past president of EMRA. Just secured my first contract last year, so excited to be here and share some pearls.
Hey everybody, my name is Jasmyne Patel. I am a PGY 3 and Chief Resident at Emory University, and I also serve as the AWEM Resident Chair. Thank you for all joining us tonight.
Hey everyone, I'm Kat Ogle. I'm an associate professor at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I am one of the AWEM vice presidents. I'm the VP of Education, and I am super excited to be here with you all.
Hi, everyone. I'm Pooja Agrawal. I'm on faculty at Yale. I am a recent past president of AWEM, and I'm currently on the board of directors for SAEM.
Hi, I'm Taylor Stavely. I'm an instructor at Emory. I'm really excited to join you guys tonight. I am the AWEM Didactics co-chair.
Thank you, everybody. And so tonight we really wanted to make contract negotiation the third webinar of our From Match to First Promotion webinar series because of the gender wage gap that exists amongst physicians. The landmark paper came out in 2016 in JAMA, and it discusses the physician salary differences despite gender. Our hope is that by equipping residents with the knowledge and understanding of what their contract entails, that they're able to make a more informed decision on the best contract and negotiate their contracts like a pro to close the wage gap. So what this study showed that despite adjusting for important factors such as age, years since residency, faculty rank, specialty, NIH funding, clinical trials, publication count, top 20 medical school, whether the institutions won those, and clinical product activity, despite adjusting for all of that, there was still an accounted for $90,878 in differences between wages. And so between salaries, and this was back in 2016. So this is why we really wanted to focus on contract negotiating today. And so we'll get started with Dr. Hannah Hughes telling us about the fundamentals of negotiation.
Thanks, Dr. Sun. So I went to business school, and I'm going to just caveat that negotiations can be like a 3-part course. But I think that the really big part of that $20,000 gender gap is just starting, right? Is how do you just start a negotiation, particularly as a graduating resident, when you're talking to chairs and you already feel like there's this huge power gap. So what is it that you have to know to kind of start that conversation? And the first is just some basic definitions. The first is your ideal outcome. So in the best case scenario, if you could think of your dream job, your dream pay, what you would do in that job, what does that mean to you? And that's going to be different for everybody. So that's your ideal outcome. Now, the next piece of that is your reservation price. This is sort of it's always monetary, but this is your walkaway dollar amount. So how much money would you have to be offered? And if you didn't get that, you would walk away, no matter who the employer was, where it was. You have to know what that price is for you. And that's going to, again, depend on your personal preferences. And it doesn't just come down to money, right? It comes down to how many hours you want to work. What site do you want to work at? Do you want to supervise? So that can be a variety of things, but you try to create a quantitative number for that. Now, the BATNA is the thing that I want everybody to walk away with today, remembering. That means the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. What that means is your power, right? That's how you can walk away when you have multiple offers, because you know that you have an alternative option that you can take to where you're going to be okay with that. So as an example, in medicine, I interviewed at 3 academic sites and 1 community site. And I knew that my community site was my backup offer, that if I didn't take any other place, that I could work there and be near my husband and make X dollars. So if you're thinking about sort of an alternative, that means that you really have to have two options. That can be fellowship, that can be traveling the country for a year and taking a year off medicine. So it doesn't have to be another job offer. It just has to be something other than the offer that you're being presented. So those are the fundamentals, but how does that really apply when you're kind of at the table with that chair or that hiring officer? Go to the next slide, if you don't mind, Dr. Sun. Okay, so don't get lost in the details, but really the point of negotiations is that you and whoever you're negotiating with, for instance, a chair, there's going to be some room where you both can agree on, right? So on the blue part on the top is where the dark blue is the chair's line. There's going to be a maximum amount that they're willing to pay to hire you. And for you, the line green, there's going to be a minimum amount that you're willing to accept. And everywhere that those overlap is what you consider a zone of possible agreement. And your goal as the negotiator, especially as the person that has less power, is to push that zone higher as possibly you can into the chair's role to get the highest amount from that chair of that department or that hiring officer. So how do you do that? Well, there's a story that I'm taking from the book, Getting to Yes. Highly recommend reading it if you're going through negotiations. And it basically says that two kids want an orange, but you only have one orange to give. So what do? Do you split the orange in half? Well, no, right? Because you don't know why they want, you can go to the next one. I appreciate that. That's the point. You don't know why those kids want that orange. So if one kid wants the peel because they're making zest for their, fancy meal, and the other one just wants to eat the orange, the best negotiating offer there is to just peel the orange and then both people get exactly what they wanted. That's how you want to negotiate for a job, is you want to understand what you value and what the hiring officer values so that you can both get the maximum opportunity. So how does that work? Well, in job negotiations, that's called integrative negotiation, meaning that it's not just about you win and I lose or vice versa. It's expanding the pie of opportunity. I win and you win. And this is what's really important in long-term relationships like hiring, because even if I don't choose to go to GW, for instance, and I interview there, I still want to maintain that negotiation and that opportunity in the future. So you never want to negotiate so hard that you burn bridges. So the value here is really taking information sharing and revealing those preferences, as opposed to when you're, for instance, buying a car, you don't want the person that's selling you the car to know how much you're willing to spend. You want to hold that information back. But when you're looking for a job, you want to be open. I wanted to say, when I walked into the room, I said, hey, I'm going to have a kid in my first year. We could talk about a little bit about that, but I want to say, I want to make sure that I can still promote in a year's time, even though I'm taking 3 months of maternity leave. That's revealing a preference that I found very valuable, because I wanted an employer that was going to celebrate that and get me through that step. So looking for those integrative solutions. So when it comes to specifically job contracts within medicine, that's the next slide, that shows you the things that basically the ease of negotiation changes as you talk about topics. So easy things that you may not even think about, like your start date, or how many hours you're going to work, or a deadline to even accept the offer. Maybe you have multiple things that you're interviewing for and you are told, hey, we need an answer in a week. Never truly a week, right? You can come back and say, I love you guys. I really need more time to think about it. Can I have a month, right? And so even that can be negotiated. As you get into more dollars, that gets a little bit harder, right? Title, role, salary, a little bit more challenging because those are more finite, particularly depending on the job market. And then the hardest things, of course, are like commuting costs, benefits, student loan forgiveness, because that's really institutional dependent typically. So the things that I want you to think about are like office space, administrative support. How can it make your life easier that doesn't just come down to the cash on hand?
So I am a brand new faculty member. I just graduated from residency a couple of months ago. And so I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about the very basics, because I felt like when I was approaching this process, there was a lot that I really didn't understand just at the most basic level. Like, what are the most basic components of a contract that I should be keeping in mind, even just starting with practice type. Later, Pooja will talk more about kind of how to follow your heart and think more about what the right practice type is for you. But generally, there are three major practice types in emergency medicine. The first is an independent contractor. This is generally a salary-based position that's based with an hourly rate, with your expected number of shifts plus RVUs, and all of this kind of comes together to give your salary. With this type of position, you need to be extremely proactive in your financial planning, and usually that requires some outsourcing in things like having an accountant, having a lawyer, and more overhead costs associated with that. I have plenty of friends who are independent contractors. A lot of them pursued, their own LLCs. So there's more overhead in that way. Groups, they can be private or democratic. In these types of models, you usually start as an employee and you somehow will kind of transition to being a partner. And it's important whenever you're reviewing a contract for a group, what's the timeline and what are the steps to become a partner? What does that look like? And how do their employees feel about that transition period? And then the last major type of group is a hospital employee, which is how most of us fall who are in any type of academic setting. I fall into this umbrella, hence the picture of me at Grady on the right is a cartoon that one of my co-residents made. When it comes to being a hospital employee in an academic setting, usually these positions tend to be more collaborative and tend to give you opportunities for education and training. This job comes with some financial stability, but you're going to generally be making less than an independent contractor. But with that financial stability, you also have some administrative stability that maybe some of those other types don't necessarily have. You can go to the next slide. So incentives. When you think of the word incentives, the first things that probably come to mind are like benefits, retirement, malpractice. But outside of benefits, there's a lot of incentives, especially when you're starting a new position. And it's important for you to think about these different components within your contract. So some of the major incentives for you to sort of file away and ask about your potential employer would be your CME funding. What does the paid time off look like? What do maternity and paternity leaves look like? Are there opportunities for paid vacation? And are there any relocation expenses? Malpractice. So as residents, I'm just feeling like, oh, I'm glad someone's taking care of that for me. I didn't really understand how it worked, what that looked like. There are two major types of malpractice insurance. There is an occurrence-based policy and there are claims-based policies. The claims made is really the standard across medical practice, which means that all claims filed during the period of employment are covered. But once a physician leaves that hospital or policy, you'll need some sort of tail coverage, meaning that you need something to follow you to cover that time of transition to a new position. And usually tail coverage is somewhere around $50,000. A new job, you need to kind of ask and find out, who is it that's covered? Is it me, my employer? Are we splitting it? And there's lots of different models for what that looks like. Occurrence coverage is really rare. The occurrence coverage, if you can find it, is great. But what that means is that that coverage includes the cost of a tail and means that any occurrence during that period of practice or employment is covered regardless of when the claim is filed. Termination. So there are two major different types of termination clauses in contracts, and one is for cause and the other is without cause. So for cause, you want to know what are the terms that someone could use to terminate you. And so usually those need to be lined out in a contract. And so what are those specific terms? And then without cause, which is the more common type, usually this comes with some sort of timeline, like, within 90 days, either the employee or the employer can terminate for whatever reason. And so it's important for you to know that timeline. Even if you were leaving for good reasons, you wanted to move because you have a promotion somewhere else, or you want to be closer to family, or something else has happened, you want to know what that timeline looks like. So it's important to know in your termination whether this is a timeline with or without cause. So the last thing that I want to talk about is restrictive covenants. So what a restrictive covenant essentially means is a non-compete clause. It's extremely important for you to know if your contract will contain anything about a non-compete clause. And what this would mean is that on termination that you couldn't work within a specific geographic location for a specific time frame. And as emergency medicine physicians, extremely limiting. I mean, essentially leaving a job would mean that you need to also hire a moving company. And so most of the major emergency medicine groups, be it SAEM or others, have written statements about denouncing these types of clauses, non-compete clauses, but they still exist. And so it's extremely important for you to review your contract for those. Others that are a little bit more forgiving will have something like a non-interference clause, meaning that you just won't interfere with your prior employer's functioning.
There's a couple other things to think about when you're going to the negotiation table. And, one of those is how committed is the organization that you're looking at to the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And do they truly have the structure and the infrastructure to support the commitment to each of these things? So when you're talking about an organization and its commitment to diversity, how does the faculty look? Does the faculty represent a diverse group of individuals, or is the faculty relatively homogenous? And if the faculty is homogenous, do you have a response from leadership about why that is and how they're planning to rectify that and how they're planning to change that? Further, if there are individuals in that organization who are taking leadership roles in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, are those roles compensated? Or are they expected to simply take on those roles because they perhaps fall into a minoritized category? The other thing that you want to think about, and we've talked about this a couple of times, Dr. Hughes mentioned that CME funding is probably one of your more low-hanging fruit, one of the easier things to negotiate. But you've got to think about your longitudinal growth, and you've got to think about how you are going to be able to move forward in your career and whether or not the organization that you're going into is going to support that. So do they have intrinsic infrastructure to support your professional development? Do they have programs within the organization that you can join? Or do they have CME funding to support that, getting that elsewhere? The other thing that you want to be clear about is whether or not they're actually transparent with regard to pay equity. So if they say that the pay is equitable, show the numbers. Where are the numbers? You want to see whether or not that transparency actually plays out. And then the other thing is that organization fostering inclusive practices as it relates to family leave? And remember that family leave is not just your typical heteronormative nuclear family. Your families can be multiple different shapes and sizes, and it can involve extended family, aunts, uncles, people for whom you're responsible, but may not fall necessarily under the category of children or parents. So what are the options for you to support your extended family, whatever that looks like? The other thing is, if you needed to take leave to take care of those family members, how is that supported? You can go ahead and go to the next slide. The other thing is, as you go to the negotiation table, and Dr. Agrawal is going to talk about this as well, it's important to know what your priorities are. So what is it that is really at the foundation of what you're talking about? And Dr. Hughes mentioned this as well. So what is your walkaway point? So is your walkaway point related to salary? Is your walkaway point related to having a certain amount of vacation time? Maybe your walkaway point is your clinical hours, the number of hours that you want to work, the number of institutions you want to work in, and what your teaching responsibilities might be. Go ahead and go to the next slide. You can also go into the things that maybe are not necessarily financial, but will definitely support your happiness and your wellness in your organization. Do you have office space? Perhaps your home life is not conducive to getting work done. And so it would be nice to have an office space in which you can do those things. So is that available? That is a very simple, low-hanging fruit that a lot of organizations can provide to you. The other thing is, what kind of administrative support staff is available in the organization? Is there someone that can help you manage your calendar? Is there someone that can help you manage your meetings? Those kind of administrative things can take up a tremendous amount of time. And one of my very smart mentors once told me, if you can pay someone else less than your salary to do the thing that you're doing, unless you love doing the thing that you're doing, you should be paying somebody else to do it. And that was a really hard thing for me to really kind of come to terms with as a first generation physician, as a first generation college grad. The concept of outsourcing to me was incredibly painful, but now I have such an incredible appreciation for that, and it should absolutely be part of your negotiation. Further, if you are a person who is a researcher, what kind of resources are available in the department to support your research? Is there someone that can help write grants? Is there someone that can help with statistics? Do you have a research team that can review your proposals and help you with the IRB? Where are the resources in the department? And sort of understanding those resources that are in the department will help you make a more informed decision when the final package is presented to you. Go to the next slide. Now, one of my favorite mentors, Dr. Risa E. Lewis, told me about this book, and it's gold. It's absolute gold, and I think that every one of you should read it. And what it really gets down to is that you have to know the facts going in. And the fact is that there's a gender wage gap, right? So at the very foundation of your conversation with any negotiation as a woman in medicine, you can go in with that, all right? Then, as Dr. Hughes mentioned, negotiation no longer needs to be this antagonistic experience. It really is a collaborative discussion. And little clue in the book, women are much better at creating collaborative spaces and integrating conversations than potentially our male colleagues might be. The other thing is, as Dr. Stavely mentioned, a lot of the stuff that is in your contract and a lot of those basics are negotiable. So you should absolutely ask about those things. And I will give you a clue, a little sort of hint, a little foreshadowing. When you hear from Dr. Patel, she's going to give you some liquid gold as far as the solid numbers are concerned for academic medicine, and something that you're going to want to pay attention to. The last thing I want to say here is the answer to every unasked question is no. If you don't ask it, no one is going to reward you for good behavior. No one is going to pat you on the back, and no one is certainly going to give you any more money or support to do the things that you need to do. So you have to advocate for yourself. And if they underpay you, they undervalue you. One of the things that you may not be prepared for is, as you move into your job, you move into the job category, negotiation is probably a yearly thing. So you're going to be going to your chair and you're going to be having conversations on a yearly basis. Please make sure that you confirm the things that you negotiated in writing with an email, just to follow up. It's good practice. It shows your chair that you're paying attention. It shows your chair that you're meticulous, and it provides you with a written record of what's going on. In addition to that, for those of you who are stepping out into this place and getting jobs for the first time, recruiters are relentless. They will call you and text you and email you until you become very tired. They're very good at kind of wearing you down. All right. And they'll call you and they say, are you ready to sign? Are you ready to sign? Do you want to do this? Do you want to do this? Do not agree to anything in a conversation on the phone with a recruiter. You need to be looking at contract in hand. You need to be able to have the contract in hand before you can make a decision. And the last piece, once you have that contract in hand, find a friend who's a lawyer, or find a friend who has a friend who's a lawyer, so they can find those little things like the non-compete clause and the termination agreements and the malpractice coverage and all of those things that perhaps, I mean, I don't know about you, but I do not do well reading 30 pages of contract material. But there are people in this world who are phenomenal at it, and it's well worth the $150 that you pay them to do that.
Thank you, Dr. Ogle. So I'm going to take another tack and speak a little bit about take a step back and think about how you specifically are going to be thinking about your first job. So as a kind of a personal reflection, I'm on faculty at Yale. I negotiated my job right out of fellowship, and I haven't moved since then. And I had a lot of good advice in retrospect. as I negotiated that first job, but there's a lot that I know now, that I consider now, that I wish I had thought about, I wish I had known to think about when I had those initial discussions. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of my perspective, with the caveat that this is really focused on academic jobs, just because that is what I know. Next slide, please. Thanks. So the first thing, what I'm going to do is I'm present kind of three main questions that I think that is a good idea for everybody to just take some time before you send out, your interview request, before you approach a chair. There are three big questions that you really need to have thought about really very thoughtfully, and have answers in your head before you start a discussion. The first thing that I'm going to say is, what is your target? Who are you speaking to? Every chair is different. Every department is different. They often will have, while everyone does emergency medicine, there's different philosophies to every single department. Everyone has a different focus, a different institutional mandate, a different leadership philosophy. And you really need to do your homework on your future chair ad nauseum before you can embark on a real discussion about your future in a department. It'll become obvious based on the way that a department functions, the priorities of the faculty group and of that chair, what their expectations will be, and how you can best position yourself within that group. Just a kind of a consideration within academic groups is that early career academic contracts are fairly standardized. There's not a lot of wiggle room. There's not a lot of negotiation around salaries. That's usually benchmarked to some kind of the institution or the dean or something. And there is more awareness now about gender disparities in medicine. Many chairs, including my own, we have to report to their average salaries by gender to their respective deans. And so there has been some movement towards equity on that level. And there's really not a lot of place where you as an individual can negotiate a salary for the most part. In the community side, there may not be the equivalent of a dean. And so there may be more of a push for people to kind of look at gender equity and pay equity, but there may be a stated goal of that institution. So just kind of knowing of that group, so just knowing that. So just kind of considering that, but knowing your target is really important. So you know that you're speaking to the right person in the right way. The next question is, know yourself and have a sense of not just who you are today, but your future self and where you see yourself positioned within academic medicine, within emergency medicine in the future. So how do you see yourself engaged within a department when you're in your mid-career, when you're in your late career? Are you planning to be a clinician? Are you going to be an educator? Do you see yourself as a researcher or as an administrator? And recognizing that that can change over time, but you really have to be brutally honest with yourself from the very beginning. And that's going to allow you to negotiate a job that you can grow into, that you can be happy with for the foreseeable future. You may say, I want to be a researcher, and realize you hate writing grants. So let's put that aside. It's fine. Not everyone has to do everything, but just make sure that you're thinking about what's going to be best for your own personal wellness and where you can be successful in the future. And the answer to this introspection, with all of the nuances that go along with it, that should really inform your conversations and your negotiations with your future chair. So then the third question is, what do you need to be successful? So putting all that aside, recognizing the context, what you want to be able to do when you speak to your chair is negotiate for the things that will help you succeed in that institution and conveys to your chair, your potential chair, that you're being thoughtful about your future and your position within that department, right? So when I say negotiate with your interest as the focus, not as your ask, what I mean by that is think about the big picture and where you want to end up being, and allow yourself the time to converse with your potential employer about what are the things that you can ask for to get yourself there. So reframe it as opposed to saying, I need time, I need money. What you want to think about is, what is it you want to become? What is your interest? So if you want to become an educator, for example, what does that trajectory look like for you? Do you think you're going to be a PD someday? Do you think you want to stay within the medical school world? Does it make sense then right off the bat to think about, well, how am I going to get from there? Maybe I negotiate a title, or maybe I negotiate a specific role within that department that will help me get there. And within that is built in some amount of support. Make sure you're not getting pulled into something that will take up a lot of time or maybe not get to where you want to go, but it certainly is something you might want to think about. Ask whether the school provides support for people in the next job. So if someone is a PD or someone is within the medical school, is there support for them? Is there financial support? You can only know how you'll be supported when you see how others are supported in that future role. Another interest, for example, if you think you see yourself as being an administrator within a leadership position, negotiate a role early on with some kind of visibility within that department. So maybe a hospital committee, maybe some kind of an assistant medical director, and ask for support, maybe for an advanced degree if an MBA would help you get there. If you see yourself as being a researcher, negotiate some kind of financial support to get you off the ground. So support for coursework, grant writing support, time to write, something that will help you get off the ground and be successful within that role. A little pearl, if you are looking at being a researcher and you're asking for time to do that, consider if you're going to say, I'd like 2 years of reduced hours, maybe think about taking that within your years 2 and 3, as opposed to your first year. The first year you can use just networking, getting to know people. And once you kind of have your plan set, years 2 and 3, you can just be out of the gate and writing your grants and really being successful that way. Just a little tip that I've seen other people use pretty successfully. Another interest could be, I want to pay off my loans. I need to be financially solvent to really be able to kind of further myself in my career. Negotiate that perhaps within the department, see if they can help you pay either by support for the NIH loan repayment program, maybe a signing bonus for that specific reason. Say, this is the reason I'm looking for this particular extra funds up front. I need that for this particular reason. Now, chairs are, for the most part, acutely aware of these fairness issues, especially in early career hires. You don't really have a track record yet. And so they're unlikely to give you a much better deal than they've given someone who they've recently hired, unless there's something that sets you apart. So as I was mentioning before, a signing bonus, only ask that if you have a specific near-term need. You want to pay off your loans, you need a car to be able to get to work. If you want more time off because you need to spend that time on career development plans, tell them what that plan is. I'm going to write this grant. I'm going to apply for this thing because it's my area of focus, and be very specific about it. And I think they'll be more likely to hear that particular ask. And while Dr. Ogle said, you're not going to get something if you don't ask for it, I really feel the way that you ask for it really matters. So a chair is not going to be necessarily interested in a lot of back and forth with a new hire, a new grad, especially if you're unproven. But if they really see that you're being thoughtful about why you want these things, they might be more inclined to do that for that. And then just to put some of the other things in perspective, like a signing bonus, for example, there are things that you're going to have a lot less control over that may have more of a financial or even non-financial importance for you. So for example, tax laws might actually give employers benefits. So that you might see variability in retirement benefits from institution to institution, or healthcare coverage or dependent care. And you may not be able to negotiate any of that. That is institutional. But all of those things potentially can add up, and something that you might consider when you're evaluating different prospects. Don't get caught up in the small negotiations up front. Those are kind of things to kind of throw out later, and I'll kind of give you a little potential pearl at the end of it. And I think just kind of big picture, on a personal level, you should calculate how much are those non-negotiable things, how important are they to you? And you don't necessarily have to share that level of information to your employers, but really think about how much is that really important? Is a retirement fund really very important? And that could be a reason to walk away despite all of the other things. So considering that. Next slide, thank you. And so to touch briefly on kind of the next steps, right? I'm thinking about this and kind of what is your long game here? To touch briefly on your next negotiation, because I think your next negotiation could inform your first negotiation and vice versa, and it will help you negotiate what you're doing now. So you're more likely to see gaps in equity and pay disparity in those mid and late career contracts, and not this one, but the next one. Because in the next few years, people are individualizing, right? Their trajectories are diverging. People are becoming they're coming into their own, and many drivers of these biases, of these income disparities are more pronounced in later contracts, because things like grant support, reputation, your individual success in different arenas, you kind of develop that, and then you bring that with you, either within the same institution or if you move to another one. So asking for something big is a bigger deal later on, because you have a history and you have a track record and you know what you need to succeed, and that might be easier to do later. So for example, kind of going back to the different avenues that people fall into. So if you are looking at staying within education, you might ask for a bigger role within a medical school committee, or an assistant dean, associate dean position or something, or GME presence. If you are in research, you may ask for guarantee of support of a postdoc or a secondary appointment in a different school within your institution. If you're clinical, when you're mid-career, you probably have a better idea of your relative clinical productivity and how you could play a role, how that could play a role in your compensation. So you might be more or less inclined to take an RVU-based job based on what you know and how you know you are clinically efficient. Administrator, if you're looking at kind of being an administrator long-term, asking for a role where you have managerial oversight over, say, an APP program or a medical director or something like that. So thinking about what that next step is and where you want to be in the future can potentially help you figure out where you are right now. It's a lot to think about, but it certainly, I think, can help. And then just kind of one little kind of extra little pearl that that I would throw out there that you can either take or leave if you don't agree with it is think about kind of your general negotiation in terms of big picture, right? So what is it that's going to make you happy? Where is it you see yourself being? And have that conversation with the chair, come to a place where you're both really satisfied with where you're going to be. And then think at the very end, a little negotiation kind of pearl or tactic is throw in something small at the very end. When you kind of have them, you already have them, almost shaking hands. They've invested a lot in the process and think, well, actually, I'd like a little extra CME, or I think maybe moving expenses would really make this a lot easier for me. And you're going to see, it's likely that a potential chair will say, this person is someone I want to invest in. A couple $1,000s for moving expenses, I'm happy to throw that in because I think there's a lot more value here for this person to be in my department. And people kind of walk away feeling very good about that when you feel like that one little extra nugget that you weren't really expecting to get in the first place. So those are my perspectives on the process.
Awesome, that was wonderful. So you've gotten a lot of tips on how to negotiate a contract and important things to consider, but where do you go to get all of this objective data? Go ahead and click. So COVID has put a wrench in things, and it makes it a little bit harder to use previous reports, makes them a little bit less reliable. But I'm going to go over some resources that you can use as a guide and sort of what you can expect, give or take. So we'll just give a second to take a look at these reports, and they have the QR codes attached to them. And then I'll go over some of them individually. So perfect. So this is ACEP's latest report on compensation from 2019 to 2020. Again, it may not be as accurate given the COVID pandemic, but if you go ahead and click, you're able to appreciate certain trends and sort of what you can expect regionally and kind of give you a gauge. Perfect. And then we can go on to the next slide. And then in regards to academics, the AAMC has a great faculty salary report from 2019. And if you go ahead and click, you can see a breakdown of salaries specific to each faculty position. And then there's another one, this is an additional resource that was a survey performed by SAEM and the academic chairs in emergency medicine. They're quite similar, but the important thing to note is that after obtaining different salaries from accredited residency programs, it shows that— I'm not sure I understand. Sorry, that's my Siri. It showed that academic salaries were higher than those reported by the AAMC. And all of this is to say that if you are interested in academics, the salary should not hold you back. And then similar findings that females are still getting paid 10 to 15% less than our male counterparts. So what if you don't even know where to begin? EMRA and SAEM are incredible resources. They have a ton of useful information as well as portals to help you navigate this challenging process. And then great resources to obtain additional objective data is ask your co-residents who are also going through this process, and then lean on residency faculty because they also have incredible wisdom and knowledge to share. Alumni are an incredible resource. They have the benefit of being a few years out, and then can also share with you their specific challenges and lessons learned. And then they also have a better grasp on the current job market, especially with the COVID pandemic. And then lastly, accessing networks. So kind of break this down into like both personal and professional networks. Your friends are incredible and they will surprise you with their connections. But also for professional networks, I highly encourage everyone to start, if you haven't already, participating in various national committees. I know that SAEM and RAMS, as well as AWEM, I believe, have just opened up new positions for the next year. And this is a great way to kind of jumpstart the process, and you will meet incredible people in this field. And then lastly, just to kind of wrap this up, we're very lucky that EM is still relatively a new specialty, and so it's still a very small world. So reach out to people. Somebody always knows somebody, and you never know what connections you may make. So I think at this time, we could definitely open the platform up to see if anyone has any sort of questions.
Yeah, so I just wanted to thank all of our speakers, and also thank you for our participants for putting in their questions in the chat right now. So I will be reading out some of the questions and hoping that our speakers could maybe answer them. And the QR code that you see on the screen right now is also a feedback form for our presentation. We always want to improve and give you better presentations on what our members want to hear. So feel free, at the end to fill this out. So essentially for our first question, it's coming from Miles. So the question is, can we talk a bit more about how to make a negotiating conversation collaborative? I understand the concept of being congenial and not burning bridges, but how can I follow the peel the orange analogy and offer something to an employer who has 30 other applicants who are similar to me? Additionally, what are your views on the negotiating climate post-COVID? Can we truly negotiate?
I'm happy to start us off with the orange peel analogy. I think in full disclosure, I negotiated my contract last year, which was sort of the height of COVID uncertainty when it came to the job market. So I think the answer is absolutely yes, you can negotiate. The question is, what can you negotiate on? I think that's the bigger piece. And so for me, and I can talk a little bit about the maternity leave, which is another question. For me, it was about trajectory and long-term growth. And so things that I was really interested in were, I negotiated time for mentorship, right? Because mentor time is really valuable and it's something that you don't think about. But I said, hey, I want a standing meeting with the vice chair of the executive vice chair of our department, because I want to learn the finances of the department, and that's who does it. And so that's who I need to learn from. So things as small as that, that I think become really important. So there's always negotiation. No chair is probably going to respond to you saying, hey, this is $20,000 less than I'd like, right? Like that's not going to go over well, unless you have another offer from an academic institution that is substantially different. But even then, I didn't find that successful because payer mixes are different, right? One place that has, a hugely insured population is going to just be able to pay their academic physicians more potentially than somebody that has more of an uninsured population, or at least that's the line that you're going to get. So I think you have to understand what really matters, and negotiating salary is hard, but for me, it was about time and trajectory. So I negotiated buy down. I negotiated how many personal requests I could get off because I was still traveling or expected to travel once a month for EMRA. And I negotiated trajectory. So I actually did a multi-year contract, meaning I knew in a year's time, there was a certain title that I wanted and a certain buy down and a certain dollar amount that I could get within a year and 2 years, because I knew that I was going to be there for an isolated time. And how you do that is, what you bring to the table, right? I'm a female in management with an MBA, and there's no other women in operations. And I served as a chief resident, and the balance of the educational mission and operation mission are often at odds with one another. And so I positioned myself as the person that could be the niche and build the bridge of education and operations. And that's what the chair needed, right? So I think it's like Dr. Agrawal said, you really have to know what your chair wants and chair values. And you're asking, okay, well, how do I figure that out? And that's network. That's talking to people that are in that institution that are junior faculty. So I called up every single University of Cincinnati grad at every place that I interviewed and said, hey, what's it like to work there? What is your chair value? Before I even walked into the room. So I think know what you bring to the table that's unique. Know that negotiation is always possible, but it's not necessarily salary alone. But remember, salary is just dollars per an hour. So buy down is negotiable, right? A lot easier than dollars in a line item of someone's budget. So just think of those sort of things. And I think one thing that I forgot to mention was I firmly believe that we don't talk enough about salary. We talk about transparency with chairs and asking it of our employers, but what about each other, right? So my two best friends that I was chiefs with last year are going through the job market right now. And I shared every offer that I had so that they would know what institutions were providing. And in that, when I went through it last year, that's how I got a contract management group to go from a $0 sign-on bonus to 40 grand. Because I said, hey, other people are getting 40 grand for similar groups. This doesn't seem fair. And so knowledge is power, but that means being really transparent with your friends and your colleagues, which we should all do as women.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Hughes. I was just wondering if any of the other speakers wanted to also answer this question. If not, then we have an additional question in the chat as well.
I put a lot of my comments to Miles' question already in the chat. So I think the other thing that you can think about is for a person in leadership who is tied into the mission and vision of your organization, you can also use that as a talking point. But I mean, I think that Dr. Hughes' comments about really doing your homework on the people that are on the ground and know that person better than anything you can find on the website is liquid gold.
Perfect, thanks. And then we also have another question for Dr. Hughes. One of our participants was asking how you were able to negotiate maternity leave and what should someone look for in a future employer if they want to have a family during their tenure.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear from the other panelists on this too. I should have said parental leave and not maternity leave. And I want to be very clear that I think this is one of those almost non-negotiables in that it's institution dependent oftentimes. And so my institution was going through a change at the time where they would have 6 weeks paid, 6 weeks unpaid, which was a big increase compared to what it was. But my ask was not for the time or money because I knew that that was dependent on the university. My ask was trajectory, because that we know that there's data to support that women that take time off of work start to fall behind when it comes to promotion. And so, but then there's also great data to show that they're really productive during that time. And a lot of researchers produce way more during parental leave than they otherwise would. So I specifically said, I know that in 12 months, I want to be at this title, this pay, but I'm taking 3 to 4 months off. Can you guarantee me? And what do I need to do that? And so I felt like it was something that you should ask about because I wanted an employer that was going to support me and not see parental leave as a downside.
Yeah, I would add that it is absolutely institution dependent. And, unlike Dr. Hughes and Dr. Agrawal and Dr. Stavely, the physician group that I work with, it's a separate physician group from the university. And so we contract with the university, but we're a multi-specialty physician group. And there is no maternity policy. There is no paternity policy. There is no family leave policy. It is negotiated on a person-to-person basis. So every single department has to have a different conversation with their chair. Every single individual has to have a conversation. And that's a challenge, right? It's something that we're trying to fix. But you should absolutely have crystal clarity about what your options are if that is something that's important to you. And I would also not just talk to the chair and the HR folks. I would talk to the other people in the department who have families. And, if there are non-traditional parents in the group, are they allowed the same opportunities to take leave, to take care of their families as your heteronormative couples are?
Thanks, Dr. Ogle.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's the policy is often not negotiable, but there are often other things you can negotiate into that, right? So certain departments you'll see are more friendly towards parental leave. And so while there might be a mandate from the institution, from the dean, from the medical school saying you only have this number of weeks, and after that you take FMLA, but some departments actually can be more thoughtful around, well, in the few months leading up to my maternity leave or my parental leave, I don't think that overnight shifts are a really good idea. Or when I come back, I think I need a little extra time just to kind of get myself back up to speed clinically. And so, thinking about if there are different units that you want to be working in that are more helpful towards if you are pumping, or if you're doing other things that are going to take away from your clinical productivity, or if you have metrics that are based on productivity that might be affected by what you're doing post parental leave. And so it's hard to know some of these things if you're having, your first child, if you're having your first kind of change to your family structure. But another reason that I think there's some good advice around talking to other junior faculty who've recently been through that and thinking, well, what was the most challenging thing for you leading up to your leave? When you return from your leave, what would have been helpful for you to kind of ease your transition back so you're not losing time and setting your clock back by a year, and making sure, I think, as Dr. Hughes mentions, being very upfront with your chair about, I intend to stay on track and this is how I'm going to do it, and make sure you're sticking to that. But this is how I plan to stay on track, and I want to be meeting the metrics and not falling behind. And so I think there are certain ways that you can make that transition more friendly, even if some of the kind of the concrete metrics you're not really able to affect.
Thanks, Dr. Agrawal. Now switching gears a little bit, we have a question regarding one of our participants want to know a little bit more about independent contracting and LLCs versus democratic groups versus employers. And there are specific things that we should be wary about when looking for jobs with each different type.
So I think you have to really be reflective and think about what it is that you want and what you want out of your position, because there's pros and cons to each of them. There's benefits to each of them, and there's things that you give up with each of them. And so I think the big first question to ask yourself is, is teaching or education, is something like that important to you? Because that's going to be your first kind of big branching point. And whether you want to pursue that actively or not, because that's really going to change kind of the shape of your future job. But from there, as Dr. Ogle mentioned, she's in a group, but also is in a major teaching position. And so there's some flexibility there. I don't think that there's one that you should be wary about, but knowing some of the difficulties and things that you might encounter in each group is important. And so, like I said, with independent contracting, you're not getting that administrative help, that you're going to be the one that's responsible for outsourcing a lot of your financial work, like taxes, financial planning, like I said, establishing an LLC. And so all of that takes your time and it takes your money, especially if you are going to pay other people to do that, which most people do. And so that's a big consideration in terms of your time and whether that's the way that you want to spend your time. But that being said, independent contractors tend to make more than some of those other groups. And so, at what cost are you willing to take on those things? I'll let Kat talk more about her group, because that's something that I don't know as much about. But the big thing is what does the road to partnership look like? Is it a grueling road? Is it a long road? And what are the certain tasks that you need to accomplish to make partner? And then with employers, and usually that is within a hospital system or an academic system, is what is the path to promotion look like? How is that timeline? What are the things that you need to accomplish? And what are the other incentives from an administrative or educational standpoint that you can achieve in that position?
Thanks, Dr. Stavely. I think Dr. Hughes has some additional thoughts.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think the biggest, as someone that had no bias, I was looking into academics and community for my first job, I would say that the biggest thing you need to know when comparing those is really what is your at-risk dollar and your guaranteed dollar, and then what are your costs. Like I dropped an Excel sheet that I used in the chat a little bit earlier, because in comparing differences of independent contractor versus a Democratic group versus, a hospital employee, the biggest things are really those things. And so one of the groups, put in a contract, hey, you're $200 an hour, right? And so that rate looked like it was pretty good and comparable to other places. But when you really broke it down, it was $100 guaranteed and then $10 per RVU. And so they said, oh, but the average person bills 10 RVUs, so it's $200 an hour. Well, as a brand new employee, I'm going to get the night shifts at the place that has low volumes. And so pulling in 10 RVUs is not going to be possible. And I know that, right? So how much of the money is guaranteed, which in academics for me, that was all of it, versus how much is at risk? And then what are the costs, right? The cost of malpractice, the cost of your own disability insurance, the cost of healthcare, because that's how you take two contracts that look like they're very different, right? 300,000 or 250 compared to 500,000, and you realize they're not actually all that different when you really pull the numbers. And so there's a lot of things about group dynamics and all sorts that's outside the scope probably of this conversation, but when you're really talking about contract negotiation, make sure you're comparing apples to apples.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes. That's awesome. And for folks who are joining us live on YouTube, I've shared my screen on the Excel sheet that Dr. Hughes has. So hopefully this will be helpful to people searching for jobs and helpful in comparing jobs. And with that, I think that's all the questions we had tonight. I just want to thank all our incredible speakers, Dr. Agrawal, Dr. Stavely, Patel, Ogle, and Hughes, for your incredible wealth of knowledge and your pearls tonight and sharing with all of us. And this webinar will be posted on YouTube. The link will be out within the next 24 hours. So for those folks that want to, review what has been said and just kind of, hear some inspirational things to, amp you up for your next interview, you're going to be awesome. Just remember, emergency medicine, we're a close and tight-knit group. So we're here to support everyone. Don't hesitate to ever reach out. And, SAEM, RAMS, EMRA, ACEP, and all the YEM organizations are out here to help you. So really reach out. We're here for you. And with that, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. And we'll see you at our 4th installment of From Match to First promotion webinar series coming in November or December. All right. Good night, everybody.